Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to critically and creatively exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. Our guest today is Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr. But I will waste no time in introducing the professor because he is in need of no formal introduction. I will simply say this. We are deeply humbled and honored to have Professor Nasr share a few minutes of his valuable time for our humble project. Thank you, Professor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm very glad to be able to spend a few minutes with you despite my very busy schedule, because the question of Muslim-Hindu relations and mutual understanding of the two has been a concern of mine all my life. I've traveled many times to India. I've known many great pundits, thinkers, philosophers, yogis, Hindu, and also Muslims who have studied Hinduism, and been a humble student of this interaction between Hindu and Islamic religions and cultures in the land of India.
Right. Well, Professor, you mentioned at one point in your writing that what we need is not just toleration of each other, but what we need is an understanding that emanates from a deep knowledge of each other's traditions. Can you please shed some light on how we might go about doing this in the context of Hindu-Muslim relations? Because these are two apparently distinct ideas or worldviews or frames of thinking and systems, right?
In the case of Islam and Hinduism, you have two traditions, theologically and metaphysically, one at the beginning of the cycle of prophecy, one at the end. Hinduism, in a sense, is the oldest primary religion that has survived through all the yugas to our own day, and Islam is the last major religion to be revealed during the Kali Yuga. And so the two, in a sense, are like the bookends of the whole cycle of prophetic revelations which God has made available to humanity over the millennia, over the centuries, whether it be in the Semitic world in the forms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or in the Indian world in the form of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, or in the Iranian world in the form of Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and so forth, all these great families of religions, or of course in the Far East in China. But in this whole context of the various families of religions, the relation between Islam and Hinduism is a particularly rich one, pertinent one, and I would say understudied one in comparison with, let's say, Hindu-Christian relations or Muslim-Christian relations or Far Eastern Christian relations. So many books, so many writings, so many comparisons, but Western scholarship has not paid much attention except to Dara Shukuh, one or two other figures. And the Muslims and Hindus have not done much of a job outside of a few very outstanding scholars who have appeared, but who are not well known outside of the world of India, who are not internationally known usually, except a few scholars here and there. People forget that for 700-800 years, there were Muslims who studied Hinduism. There were Hindus who studied Islam. There were Hindus who wrote in Sanskrit about Persian poetry and Sufism. There were Muslims who wrote about yoga, about Samkhya, about the Vedanta in Persian, sometimes Arabic, and later on, of course, when local languages developed in Indian local languages even. It's, you have an unbelievable wealth of literature. I have several students who've been my students for some years and very gifted, who are Islamic scholars, but who also know Sanskrit. And I've sent them to India. Some of them came back very recently. They've made discoveries which nobody knows of, major works, written both from the Hindu side and the Islamic side, concerning the relationship between Hinduism and Islam. So we're dealing with a very fecund field. Of course, there's been scholarship in it, but one which is, in a sense, still a virgin land to be explored And it's very important on every level, spiritually, intellectually, politically, socially, with all the enmity between Pakistan and India, with what is going on with the BJP inside India today against Islam. And that's very, very important practical consequences. So I'm so glad you, as a young Muslim scholar, are undertaking this. There are now a number of Hindu scholars, whom I do not know personally at all, in India, who are doing this in reverse. That is, they're devout, very orthodox, very well-learned Hindus. Some of them are pundits, but who are very much interested in the relationship between Hinduism and Islam, especially the intellectual, metaphysical, theological aspects of Islam. And in fact, one of them even wrote an article recently on myself at the Advaita Vedanta. And so that's just Seyyed Hossein Nasr, Advaita Vedantist. There's been a lot of writings going on. Unfortunately, I do not know Hindi and some of the local languages, even Tamil and Malayalam and southern languages, in which these things are being written, but I know it's taking place.
Right. Well, if we can actually get to one or two specific points of contention or apparent conflict or apparent contradiction between these two great traditions, it is that of the idol or the image or the icon. Of course, there's a famous verse by Mahmoud Shabistari, which you quote, Professor. I would like you to please recite that in Persian, if possible, and explain it to us.
First, with pleasure. First of all, let me tell you that each religion reveals its truths in different forms. The truths on the highest level the same. The truth is always that of Tawheed. You don't have two Oms. You don't have two Atmas. You don't have two Brahmans. You do not have two Allahs, astaghfirullah. It's always, it begins with Tawheed, but the way it's like a water cascading down a mountain, down to the earth, it takes different forms. And different religions have different forms. Islam is a religion in which the truth of the religion are expressed in what we would call abstract language, although I do not like this word abstract very much, because it's also something very concrete, and the Quranic language is also very concrete. But anyway, making use of ideas rather than images. Hinduism is a religion which is revealed in forms of the gods and practices which relate to icons. And so you might say that, for example, Hindu art is iconic, sacred art. Islamic sacred art is aniconic, but they're both sacred art. A piece of Quranic calligraphy or work of traditional Islamic architecture in comparison, let's say, with the Hindu temple or Hindu paintings of the gods and the statues and so forth, reveals this difference. One is iconic, one is aniconic. But having said that, throughout the ages, you had, first of all, Hindus who explicitly, especially those of the school of Advaita Vedanta, of course, but even other schools, stated that all the gods are manifestation of one single reality. The Upanishads speak about that. Neti, 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 neti. When Yajnavalkya goes to ask, what is the truth? It's not this, it is not that.
Right.
It's like saying La ilaha illallah, those verses of the Upanishads. And in Islam, there have been the other movement that although Islam is based on the ta'ali, that is transcendence of God, the purity of the oneness of God. Also, there are also the Sufis especially have spoken, not made, but spoken a language which is icons in a sense. And it's in that context that you might understand the famous verse of Sheikh Mahmud Shabistari, which was one of my favorite verses of Persian poetry and very daring. And Musalman, در بدانستی که بت چیست بدانستی که دین در بت پرستی است. If a Muslim were only to know what an idol is, he would know that real religion is idol worship. This is a very, very daring sentence coming out of Tabriz in the middle of Persia, middle of the Islamic world 800 years ago. But it's such a profound and important verse that is Islam, but also from the other side, it's sages, it's metaphysicians, especially the Sufis, not all, but many of them, understood that the icon symbolizes a reality beyond itself, but it also makes it present, not only symbolizes it indirectly, but makes its presence here and now possible. And that Islam does that through the word. When I say Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, these are sounds that come out of my mouth, divine compassion, the compassion of God, but they can contain that power, the power of the presence of God, except through words. In Hinduism and also in Christianity, we have the icon of Christ and the Virgin, of the Mother. But especially Hinduism, which just has so many icons of different so-called gods. The gods are really not divinities in the absolute sense, the manifestations of the one divinity, and that's what the Advaita Vedanta even goes beyond the gods. Obviously, that means anti-Hindu stuff, or it's the heart of Hindu intellectuality. And the great Shankaras and so forth have been the pillars of Hindu tradition. Anyway, in the Islamic tradition, as in Judaism, going back to the origin of the Abrahamic family of religions, and including Christianity, which in contrast to Islam and Judaism, does have the icon of Christ and the Virgin, especially in Catholicism, less so in Protestantism, but nevertheless, it's present. In the Abrahamic world, the icon does not play the same role as it does in the Hindu world. But if you take the whole economy of the religion, there's a correspondence.
Right.
Whereas you as a Muslim, we say, for example, Al-Qadir. A Hindu will look at the statue of Indira or Hanuman or some powerful god or goddess. And it doesn't mean that it is worshiping that. It is worshiping through it. Of course, you have decadence in every religion. And some Muslims blame that the Hindus are worshiping these gods. The Hindus could say to Muslims, you go to the tomb of a saint, and instead of praying to God, you're praying to the saint, as if he were God. You come from the subcontinent of India, I come from Persia, somebody else comes from Egypt. Throughout the Islamic world, you can see that.
Right.
Ordinary people know that we should only pray to God. We should not even pray to the Prophet. We should pray through the Prophet to God. But only the spiritual, intellectual elite understand that fully when they do it. Ordinary people, when your mother and my mother, you and I felt sick as a child. Of course, we pray to God, but we also pray to some ordinary saint to help cure my child. This is a natural thing. And we Muslims do not have the right really to criticize Hinduism of idolatry when we do it ourselves in another way. Yes, we don't make statues. We don't have statues of Ar-Rahman sitting on the shelf and another statue of Ar-Rahim sitting over there. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But to turn divine qualities from icons into idols in the negative sense that the Quran mentions, thanab, in the Quran, that is a proclivity and tendency in all religions. And Islam had the grandeur of always combating, especially in the atmosphere of the Arab Jahiliyyah, who had really reduced the symbol to a fetish, to break those idols. Mullah Sadr, the great Islamic thinker, has a book called Kathrul Asnam al-Jahiliyyah, to break the idols of the age of ignorance. Of course, it's talking metaphysically and philosophically. Idols of the mind, not only physical idols. But taking that and applying that to Hinduism is wrong. Why is it that the Arabian religion disappeared? There are still 850 million Hindus, or a billion Hindus around the world, in India and surrounding areas. If there was not something of the truth in the religion would die. Otherwise, how could God's mercy permit for human beings to live in error forever? I mean, it could be a short time. We have had many religions who've gone astray, who turned to magic and so forth and so on, gradually died. What happened to the Greek religion? What happened to the Olympian religion? What happened to the Roman religion? What happened to the religion of the ancient Mesopotamia? Judaism is still around. Its contemporaries in Iraq, what happened to those religions? They all died. Because God does not permit, except for the slow process of that, for something to her error to survive continuously, to misguide millions of people every generation. I mean, what kind of conception of God do we have? How can God be unjust, astaghfirullah, in guiding us Muslims in your part of the world or my part of the world, misguiding all those Hindus or Christians or Jews somewhere else? I certainly am not of that view. I belong to an aspect of Islamic tradition for which the universality of Islam is central. And the Quran is the most universal sacred text. It addresses all human beings. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. It doesn't say you're only Arabs or Persians or Muslims even. And there are other verses which, chapter 5, other places of the Quran where God speaks, in fact, of various people as long as they have faith in God. So this whole debate between Islam and Hinduism, and the question of idols that you brought up, must be understood not only socially, but also metaphysically and psychologically. The Semite sitting before an idol usually has a different reaction than an Indo-European or a Chinese or a Native American Indian. And that is why God sent all the Abrahamic religions to the Semitic world. That was his mercy. Abraham comes and breaks the idols.
Right.
La uhibbu al-afilin. That does not love that which sets even the stars as idols and only worships the one God. And he's the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all the prophets that come after Abraham in our chain insist on this question of Tawheed. But God did not plan for the Abrahamic religions to cover the whole world. Otherwise, they would have covered the whole world. How can one go against the will of God? Why are there, of the 1.5 billion Chinese, only 100 million Muslims, another 50, 60 million Christians, and the rest are Confucian, Taoist, or atheists, whatever they are? They're not Abrahamic. And some Southeast Asia and Europe and so forth and so on, many other parts of the world.
Indeed. And of course, you also mentioned that the very fact of realizing or recognizing truth in other religions reinforces the certainty in one's own religion. And you realize the fact that God, wherever you turn, there is the face of God, as the Quran says.
Yes, that's a very, very important point that you mentioned. Religions are like populations, human beings living in different places. If you have some disease like cholera that starts in Iraq, it gradually would seep into Iran. I'm mentioning my part of the world, or let's say Pakistan, Afghanistan, and your part of the world, and India, Pakistan. It seeps into the neighborhood, you might say, and can affect other religions. They have to protect themselves from what is happening when one religion catches a malady of a serious kind spiritually. This is now what has happened in the modern world. One religion, Christianity, unfortunately, not Eastern Christianity and not all Christians, but the mainstream Christianity of Europe in the 17th century began to weaken and to give up much of society to irreligion. Science, technology, much of the arts, social discourse, laws. If you lived in the Christian world 1,000 years ago, all laws that were passed were considered to be in accord with Christian teachings. But now, living in Washington, when they're passing a law in the Congress a few blocks down, do they talk about whether it's in accord with Christianity or not? They don't even talk about it. The sentence never comes out of a big building, not once. So it was a great secularization that took place. And for some time, it remained only in Western Europe and North America. And then gradually in the 19th century, it began to spread. And we have that problem today, of the weakening of religion everywhere in the world. Some were stronger, some were weaker, yes. I always tell my students, France in the Middle Ages was called the bride of the church, the bride of the Christian church. Today, only 5 to 6% of French men and women go to church on Sunday. Only 5 to 6%. 40% are atheists. 20% are agnostics. That means 60% of the people of France, put the Muslim population, Jewish population aside. I mean, the mainstream that used to be Catholic, mostly a few Protestants. The population of France, 60% has cut itself off from religion, from God. That's some of the major countries of Europe. You don't have that phenomenon in the Islamic world or in India, especially in Hinduism. China, because it's a communist, is a very complicated situation I'm going to get into. There's a major revival of both Taoism and Confucianism in China. But in my own part of the world, the Islamic world, if you go to a Friday prayer in Cairo, the mosques are so filled, they spill into the street, people's prayer in the streets. Not one place you could find for Friday prayer unless you go early in any of the mosques. Damascus, Cairo, Rabat, Karachi, I don't care where you are in the Islamic world. It's not only in Cairo. You go to Jakarta, it's the same thing in Indonesia. And in Hindu India, these two civilizations, religions, Islam and Hinduism, have preserved an intensity of religion, which is unique in the secularization world. But at the same time, they both suffered a great deal from secularization and the rise of fundamentalism and all of these things which seem to be against secularization, but are the other side of the same coin. The BJP is against everything that is against Hinduism, but it's itself destroying Hinduism. It's a universality with the bigoted understanding it has of other religions, what it's doing to Islam and Christianity in India and many other places. I could give examples. It's not India alone.
Right. Well, one final point, if I may, Professor. You write about Sanatana Dharma and
What?
Sanatan Dharma.
Dharma.
Sanatana Dharma.
Yes.
Or the Hikmat al-Khalida.
That's right.
How might these perspectives help us understand or help us situate ourselves in this dialogue?
They're crucial. They're crucial. In the old days, religions did not have to take cognizance of each other. To be a good Christian in France, you did not have to study Judaism, although your neighbor might have been a Jew. In the Islamic world, you may have had a Christian living next street You did not have to study, and vice versa. Vice versa. You saw even geographical proximity did not necessitate. Yes, comparative religion was not a popular subject in the Middle Ages. Although you did have many places where it was India, Muslims and Hindus living close together. Europe, where Jews and Christians lived together. Southern Europe, where Muslims and Christians and Bosnia, places like that, what was Yugoslavia, and those areas lived together. You did not have, you had exceptional, sometimes in Spain, one or two places in Sicily, but by and large, you did not have this exchange that is now taking place. We now live in a world in which not to accept any religion but your own puts you in the danger of losing your own religion or becoming bigoted. If I'd never seen a pious Hindu or a Christian, I would say, it. Islam is the only religion. But if I see a really pious Christian, a really pious Hindu, or a Buddhist, or a Jew, or whoever, and I ignore it, I'm doing something to myself. I'm doing something to myself in a negative sense. And so the idea that is not new, that has always existed, the idea of the perennial philosophy, the Sanatana Dharma, the Hikmatul Khalida, you have the equivalents of it, is now an extremely important idea to take seriously. I don't mean only in the philosophical sense like Aldous Huxley and the like, but the reality itself. Historically, the word perennial philosophy, which comes from the Latin, half Latin of Greek, philosophia perennis, came into vogue in the 17th century. The great German philosopher Leibniz said, I belong to the philosophia perennis. It was used before that by a bookkeeper of the Vatican, who almost certainly got it from Islamic sources, because before this term appeared in Latin, we had it in Arabic and Persian, the Persian Javidan Kharad, which was the title of the journal I edited in the Imperial Academy of Philosophy when I was in Iran, and we had this wonderful journal. I was titled Javidan Kharad in Persian, and it's Al-Hikmatul Khalida in Arabic. And we have a book by Ibn Maskawayh, Ibn Maskouye, the great Muslim philosopher of the 11th century, with the title Javidan Kharad. So the word was there even before Sohrawardi speaks about it extensively. And in India, you always had the idea of Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma, Dharma that always is and always was. And the 20th century experience of humanity, in which now the religions meet together. You have a roommate at college who happens to be a Buddhist or something like that, whereas in the 19th century, even in America, that was very unlikely, because there's a Christian or a Jew, that was it. There was nothing else. But now you have this diversity. Necessitates, in fact, paying more attention to the perennial philosophy. And also the perennial philosophy is the only source which can provide ultimately the metaphysical arguments against the errors of the modern world, against the forgetfulness of God, of the spiritual life, of putting the world ahead of the spirit, which is happening so much around us, which every consideration is so-called human consideration. What about God's consideration? What about him? What about him? This is a major debate that is going on in our world. And I believe that despite confusion, despite opposition in certain circles, that the perennial philosophy is rapidly being recognized as a very cogent and important, at least if not a perspective, a philosophical perspective. Something personal myself, in the year 2000, they got in touch with me to do a volume of the Library of Living Philosophers on my thought. Except for Martin Buber, who was an Orthodox Jewish thinker, none of the people who for whom this volume had been prepared, from John Dewey to Alfred North Whitehead, so on and so on, all the great philosophers of the West, except Heidegger, have a volume devoted to them. None of them were really perennialists or interested in tradition in the way that I have people like me speak. And I was very, very surprised that I was invited for that. And that was the beginning of the recognition on behalf, if not all, out of many people in universities, other places, professors of religion, professors of philosophy, of the importance of the perennial philosophy. And now, even in academic circles in the Anglo-Saxon world, where logical positivism, the Oxford School, has dominated since the Second World War, since really Alfred North Whitehead died, and Hawking, his students and people like that died. Since then, even in that world, there's now recognition that we should take the perennial philosophy seriously. Anyway, to conclude, as for I myself personally, I've tried in my humble way to study Western philosophy since I was the greatest teacher of Western philosophy. I was always special interest in medieval philosophy. I knew Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, all of these great French scholars, especially Gilson, who was the greatest scholar of medieval philosophy, revived medieval philosophy as philosophy in the West. They rendered a very great service. And the rise of Neo-Thomism from Maurice de Wolf and others is related to the same movement. Anyway, also to try to study Islamic philosophy. I've spent my lifetime studying it. I'm a humble student of it. I've taught it for many years. I've written hundreds of articles about it. I also study Hindu philosophy and Chinese philosophy. I met many great Hindu thinkers and philosophers, and also Confucian scholars, both inside China and outside China. All my life, I've been a perennialist. Ever since my 20s at MIT, when I had a spiritual awakening, from my point of view, a transformation. I was 19 years old, second year at MIT. Ever since, and I consider myself a perennialist, and I believe that perennialism doesn't mean that there's nothing new under the sun, although Aristotle said there's nothing new under the sun. It means that the sun always shines. And it might have a new day, but it's the light of the sun that makes a new day a new day.